Our world is welcoming the birth of the 7 billionth living human. But is this good news or bad news?
Maybe a disastrous thing for the Earth.
In some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad.
Our world is growing at an unprecedented pace. From 3 billion people in 1959 to 7 billion people just 52 years later. From education and healthcare to unemployment and the environment. Lifestyles travels the world asking experts the question, can our world cope? An in-depth look at how our world's ever-growing population is affecting our daily lives, only on CNC World.
Hello and welcome to Lifestyles. I am Sheila in Beijing. According to the United Nations estimate, the world's population would touch 7 billion today. According to Reuters, a baby girl named Danica Camacho, who was born in Fabela Maternity Hospital in Manila on October the 31st, has become the Philippines' symbolic 7 billionth baby as part of the United Nations 7 billion global population projection. The birth will be a milestone for the entire world, which has such a fast-growing population. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon will hold a news conference Monday to mark the date and talk about challenges ahead, particularly how to reduce poverty, invest in the world's 1.8 billion youth, and help countries develop in a sustainable way. The breakthrough of a 7 billion population has many people asking if our world is growing too fast and if we can continue to cope if the population continues to boom at this pace. Lifestyles travel the world to find out how the 7 billionth birth will impact the lives of people.
On October 12, 1999, 2 minutes past midnight, Adnan Mevik was welcomed to the world.
Bravo.
Healthy male baby, 3.5 kilogram weight, 52 centimeter height.
His family in Serbia couldn't have been happier. Adnan was their first and only child.
I am a happy mother. I couldn't wait to have a baby.
The world also celebrated Adnan's arrival because he became Earth's 6 billionth resident.
Here in Sarajevo is the symbol of hope, 6 billionth human being and the world.
Today, Adnan is a 7th grader in Belgrade, and Lifestyles caught up with him and his still growing parents. Amazingly, just 12 years after Adnan's historic birth, the world is marking another population milestone. The 7 billionth living human being has been born. So how did our population grow so much, so fast? According to the United Nations, to get to 7 billion people, it took 227,000 babies being born every single day. That's 158 newborns each second. Astonishing when you consider that the world's population didn't even reach 1 billion until 1804. It took 123 years to hit the 2 billion mark in 1927. Then the population pace hit full speed, 3 billion in 1959, 4 billion in 1974, 5 billion in 1987, and 6 billion in 1999. Today, the UN estimates the world's population grows by some 83 million people each year. So many that if each newborn were placed side by side, they would circle the Earth 3.5 times. "60% of people today live in Asia. But the impact of their existence is felt around the world. And depending on who you ask, they're either an asset or a major problem."
Well, 7 billion is quite a maybe a disastrous thing for the Earth. Okay, so I should just...
Robert Wyman, a developmental biology professor at Yale University in the United States, actually says 7 billion people is a very, very scary scenario, especially if the current birth rate continues.
And which we mean the number.
According to the UN, if the current fertility rate were to remain constant around the world, the population could reach nearly 27 billion by the end of this century. The best way to prevent that from happening is to slow down the number of annual births. In fact, the UN says if women had just one less child in their lifetime, the world's population at the end of the century could be 6.2 billion, a decline from our current population. But not everyone sees this growth as negatively as Dr. Wyman.
In a way, it's a good news because, the population growth is the result of the difference between death rates and birth rates. Population growth can trigger technological innovations. So in some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad.
It not be bad news per se, because the population is growing in most parts of the world, especially in the developing world, whereby the growth rate is high. But there are issues to do with how do you cater for that population in terms of having resources that can enable the population utilize those resources for better life.
That concern has been around for centuries. In fact, well-known population expert Thomas Malthus published a series of essays on the effects of population growth until his death in 1834. Malthus warned that the increase in population would eventually lead to a world that couldn't feed itself because of lack of land for crops. Today, the developing world does struggle to feed its people, as evidenced by the recent famine in the Horn of Africa.
You can boom for a while, but you can eat yourself out of your own survival and expect a crash later on of population.
But what Malthus didn't predict were the advancements in science and technology, which have helped the world increase food production, and the increase in migration from areas with fewer resources to those rich in resources. Take China, for example. It is now the world's most populated country. In the last 10 years alone, some 260 million people have left rural, less developed areas of the country and settled in large cities, seeking a better life. And until the country can offer people in those areas a similar standard of living, the number of migrants is expected to increase.
It's a shame because the people in developing countries really would prefer to stay home. You're always more comfortable at home, but conditions are just so crowded, so impossible there that they're not able to. And they're showing it.
People in China and countries around the world are not only moving within their home country in search of quality of life, they are willing to immigrate to foreign countries, despite the fact that they have to leave everyone and everything they've ever known.
First of all, they are very lonely. They're isolated. They are very small families that they have to strike just to survive in this new country.
Mary Cam works for one of the many immigrant settlement programs operating in Canada, one of the world's most popular destinations for immigrants. According to the country's 2007 census, a vast majority of its 1.6 million new residents between 2001 and 2006 were immigrants.
We have a back home is farmer, and farmer, they work so hard in the farm and the life, and then we came to Canada. We got a job here, little job. We were working in the machine shop. Then I choose to start my own business. Since when I start my business, I got my own freedom. And India might be a little bit hard to start business in those days.
In Canada, it seems that immigration is a win-win. The reason, because of the country's current low birth rate, immigrants are becoming more and more essential to Canada's workforce. In fact, between now and 2030, Canada says it will rely on immigrants as its major source of population growth. But not every country is excited about foreign population growth.
But how many can we take? If our borders were open, you know, vast numbers of Chinese would want to come, vast numbers of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and so on. And they're all individually wonderful people, you know, easily as you know, just they're not different than Americans. They're fine, but they may be poor and uneducated, and how much can we take? And the same is true for Europe or Australia and any of these places. So that's a very big problem.
A big problem that has led to major conflicts.
A man who disguised in a police uniform opened fire on Friday at a youth camp outside Oslo.
It's just, you don't think this is going to happen in northern parts of Europe, really. It's something you just see about in the TV, and that's really shocking.
On July 22, 2011, Norway saw anger over immigration turn deadly. In recent years, immigration in Norway has become a major issue, thanks in large part to the growth of its Muslim population. The issue came to a deadly head in July when Anders Behring Breivik, the man behind the massacre, claimed the government's failure to curb the Islamic immigration tide was a major reason for his attack on the innocent.
Europe has to fight very strongly any kind of racism in the future. I think there's time now that the democratic forces of Europe stand up and say really strongly, fight the beginning, fight the Nazis, fight this right-wing extremism.
Sadly, despite his age, Adnan has already seen the effects of the world's growing population firsthand. The 6 billionth living human hasn't experienced the hatred caused by immigration firsthand, but his life has been plagued with population-based problems. Life was good for Adnan and his family, who live in a small town in central Bosnia, until Adnan's father was diagnosed with cancer. Like many people who live on a fixed income, paying for medical expenses has become a major burden.
I used to have a job, but suddenly I got sick and had to retire. We now have to live on my retirement benefits, about 160 euros a month.
According to the World Health Organization, some 1 billion people today lack access to adequate health care. To change that, Adnan wants to become a doctor when he grows up. But in the meantime, countless people around the world are still left struggling to survive. People like 15-year-old Juliet Achieng in Kenya. Juliet was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma 3 years ago. Her Aunt Teresa, who has taken care of her since her mother died of meningitis, says it's nearly impossible to afford the treatments.
It is very expensive. And moreover, at such a time when the cost of living is very, very high. It is very, very hard, very expensive on me.
This is not new either, because we are seeing that in Africa, but we have seen that before in Asia and in India, in China, or we have seen that also in South America.
Despite setbacks, people around the world are now living longer than ever before, thanks to advancements in healthcare. There are still some extreme exceptions like Swaziland, where people on average only live to be 40 years old. But internationally, life expectancy has now reached 67 years, according to the United Nations, and people in developed countries are living much longer than that. For example, the average person in Japan lives to be 83. Living longer should be good news, but as our population grows, so does the number of elderly. As of 2009, the world's 65 and older population was 516 million. By 2050, the international elderly population is expected to triple to 1.53 billion. In China alone, there are already 180 million senior citizens. That's more than the populations of Germany, Italy, and Canada combined. With the world's population growing, that should make it easier. But the situation is complex in China. 90-year-old Zhuang Keiyun has 4 sons. Despite hectic work schedules and families of their own, Zhuang's children have all invited him to live with them. But he has refused because he doesn't want to be a burden on their busy lives.
My health is okay, and my 4 sons don't earn a lot of money, so I don't want to burden them.
Zhuang's story isn't unique. Many elderly people, especially in the more developed areas of eastern China, are now living alone in their golden years. Traditionally, children in China were expected to take care of their parents as they aged. In many cases, a child moved their parent into their home and supported them after they retired. But because of China's one-child policy, the family structure has changed. Today, the only child is not only responsible for supporting their parents, but also the parents of their spouse. The time and cost required has become too much for many children. But in order to curb the country's baby boom, the one-child policy was adopted.
China is unique in the world. For the big country, it has really led the world in decreasing their birth rate. In terms of a big size like that, there's no other country that comes close. And if we take China out of the statistics for the world, it looks even less optimistic. You know, the fall in fertility will be much less pronounced, and et cetera, because China has done so fabulously well. Now, I've interviewed people from China about this, and I know that many Chinese have suffered a lot under the one-child policy. Many people, especially the peasants, want a lot of children, or at least more than one child, and they have sacrificed a lot. And in a sense, the rest of the world should appreciate that. I don't think we do appreciate that, but I think we should.
Many people in China sacrificed a family for the greater good of their nation. But caring for the aging population is still a major burden here and around the world. And according to the Population Reference Bureau, the problem is only expected to get worse. Today, there are only 9 persons of working age for every person over 65. By 2050, despite the growth in population, that number is expected to drop to just 4. To make matters even worse, many people who make up the working age population are finding it much more difficult to find a job. Adnan's family knows that all too well. Not only is his father sick and without a job, his mother is also unemployed. So Adnan does what he can to help out.
I help my mom around the house. I make my bed, I dust. I help Dad by going to the pharmacy and grocery store.
According to the International Labor Organization, as of 2009, some 240 million people around the world were jobless. Thanks to the current global economic crisis, 26 million people in America alone are unemployed. To ensure Adnan doesn't become a statistic, his family is making education a priority, and he's excelling. But even today, educating the world's population is still a struggle. According to UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, 793 million adults still lack basic reading and writing skills, and 1 in 5 15-year-olds in Europe are also considered to be functionally illiterate.
Climbed up on the tree. She clambered and leapt to where gay monkeys slept and whispered, "Sleep."
It's a growing issue that Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands has dedicated her life to change. The princess, who has long been a literacy advocate in Europe, says her goal is to make sure every child in the EU can read.
All the discussions, both with children as well as adults who are struggling with reading, keep motivating me. And I know that if we together, with all the players involved, make this a priority, we can make it happen. So I'm an optimist, and so I'm driven by the notion of we can actually make a huge improvements. But we all have to put our minds to it. It's not something just for schools. It's not something just for others. It's everybody together.
The European Union is home to some of the world's wealthiest nations, yet educating the masses is still an issue. So imagine how difficult it can be when the masses have to fight to make ends meet. Jeremy Kaburia is one of those people. The 38-year-old security guard in Nairobi, Kenya, is pursuing a degree in mass communications, desperate to make life easier for him and his family. But pursuing that education is difficult. Jeremy only earns $100 a month, 40 of which goes directly to school fees. Some months, there isn't enough money to go around. But Jeremy believes his investment will pay off.
When I am in the studio, I feel free. It doesn't matter if I'm older. I don't mind studying with my children. As long as I can build a better life, I am happy.
Despite the growing population, more and more people in our world now have access to higher education. In fact, according to a study from Harvard University, 6.7% of the world's population now has a college degree. That's 469 million people. And roughly 57% of young people on Earth now go to college, a whopping 20% increase from just 10 years ago. The numbers may sound encouraging, but according to Professor Wyman, it's nearly impossible to educate everyone in the world, no matter how many people there are. The reason?
Virtually all the population growth is among poor people. It can be poor people in, especially the very big countries, because they have so many, or it can be poor people in countries that are generally poor. So like India, the richer people, the educated people that have good middle-class jobs in India, they're reproducing like anybody else. But there's masses of poor people in India, and they're still having 3.5 children. So India adds about 20 million a year. The world population is growing at 80 million a year. That's 1 billion people every dozen years.
And that has the world community concerned, even Adnan's father.
I am glad that the babies are born, but I am afraid it is not all good. There is too much poverty and people can't live a normal life. And most babies are born in poor families. I cannot tell the future. God created us all, but it seems God is destroying us too. The world is upside down, that is my belief.
Adnan's father may believe that God is destroying our world, but experts believe we are responsible for all of this destruction, thanks to irresponsible development in response to a growing population. Today, our world is facing climate change, deforestation, famine, and more because of damages to the environment.
There's a lot of discussion about the implications of high population growth on climate change, for example. And that means, how much more a bigger population produces in CO2 gases. And the answer is that it's rather a complex relationship, because it's not only the number of people, it's whether those people are great consumers or not such great consumers.
And according to Professor Wyman, the lack of care for our planet has compounded over the years, creating social and political disasters. Something he worries will only get worse as the world's population gets bigger.
Uncontrollable anything, in this case uncontrollable population growth, is the social disruption. Again, I'm not predicting any of this, just, you ask me, if we go up into this crazy level of population, what's going to happen? And it's not a pretty picture.
Thankfully, people around the world are not only trying to curb the damage already done to our environment, but are also planning for a better future, thanks to environmentally friendly measures adopted by businesses, governments, and individuals. Progress is slowly being made. But as we prepare for another 1 billion neighbors by 2023, much work needs to be done. That change of attitude, especially over the next several decades, will directly impact the world we create for our children. And according to experts, the first step we must collectively take is to reduce the fertility rate.
So I would advise that in future, more and more clinics to take care of family planning services should be opened, incorporated into our health system, and some have even advised that it should be incorporated into social systems so that people don't see fertility like a disease. So if we can reduce fertility and reduce mortality so that the gap between fertility and mortality start to shrink, then you can reduce the rate of natural increase of population.
But even if the world slows down the rate, we are all still responsible for caring for the largest ever population on Earth.
The rich countries need to realize that our well-being is dependent on the prosperity and well-being of developing countries, and we need to see that our consumption affects the well-being of developing countries. So the rich countries need to get their house in order and help the poor countries get their house in order.
From migration to healthcare to unemployment, education, and our environment, each must be made priorities in order for everyone to live the life they deserve.
So we are now at a very special point in time where it is crucial what is going to happen next.
No one is more concerned about ensuring a successful and prosperous future for generations to come than Adnan. He wants nothing more than a better life for everyone, especially his 7 billionth brother or sister. His wish?
I hope they're happier than me, that they will be taken care of by the United Nations and do well in school.
This is CNC World, a new perspective.